Welcome to the second panel in the NYU Urban Lab's series, A Green New Deal for the FDR. Today, we're going to be talking about sustainability and infrastructure, and in particular, looking at the East Side Coastal Resiliency Plan. My name's Matthew Kwatinetz. I'm a professor at NYU and director of the NYU Urban Lab. The Urban Lab is part of the Schack Institute of Real Estate. We have a series of centers, including the REIT Center, the Center for a Sustainable Built Environment, and the CREFC Center for Real Estate Finance. The Urban Lab itself is focused on inclusive growth. We'll talk about that a bunch today. We are doing work to try to quantify ESG and impact investment in real estate and look at it specifically through the lens of social equity, environmental justice, governance, and sustainability. Other projects that we're working on besides this Green New Deal for the FDR include a project on historic Black colleges and universities and their role as anchors and how their history is similar to the history of redlining for families. The actual treatment of HBCUs over time in federal policy has led to an impoverishment of those communities around them. We're also looking at the adaptive reuse of malls and supercenters, how that might create a more equitable and sustainable suburbs. We're examining Reno as a case study in gentrification and how ESG and impact developers might be able to reverse that toward the beginning, and looking at the metaverse and its possibilities for showing the different views of human settlements across the country. We have a research campus in Nevada that looks at ephemeral cities, refugee cities, rural areas, tribal areas, and urban areas as well. Today, focusing back on the Green New Deal for the FDR, I'm really pleased to have this incredible lineup of speakers, Cortney, Frank, Sarah, Amy, and Trever. Each of them is going to get a chance to introduce themselves. Before we do that, I wanted to spend just a moment talking about a context for the larger initiative and ESCR today. So for those of you that don't know, the FDR Drive is a 10-mile, 6-lane parkway along Manhattan's eastern waterfront. It is aging at different levels, but really is reaching the termination of its age in many locations. In addition to that, we have rising seas due to climate change along some of the most populous neighborhoods and some of the neighborhoods with the highest concentration of affordable and public housing. All of these are at high risk of flooding. And while there have been several separate city resilience planning efforts, we really are trying to look at this as a holistic and transformative view, not only reactive, but proactive to the kind of big visions New York City has had in the past. Here is just a view at some of the significant flood and resilience issues that we see encroachment all along the entire length of the FDR. There have been lots of different studies about what kind of planning and modalities can be utilized. Community work, in fact, it's somewhat dizzying how many studies there have been. We have put those all on our website. We'll drop that link in the chat here. There's some briefing materials there for you to find out more about that. Today, we're going to be focusing in on ESCR, which really is in the center here of Manhattan's east side from East 25th to Montgomery Street. I will let each of the panelists talk more about this, but just trying to give you a view of what is going on. Construction is underway in East River Park, which is Project Area 1. It began in December of 2021. There have been a couple of deliverables, including in February of this year, the first floodgate was installed in Project Area 2. And also we had the playground open in May of this year. As we look forward, we at the Urban Lab are particularly interested in trying to pull from these expert panelists some best practices for advancing equitable complex transportation and resilience projects. We're going to continue with this series of panels, probably leading to a technical assistance panel in partnership with the Urban Land Institute later next year. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to each of the panelists. Each of them is going to talk a little bit about their background and their relationship to this project. And I'd like to first introduce Cortney, the president and CEO of the Waterfront Alliance. Cortney, turning it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Let me see if I can share my screen. Are you all seeing anything at this point? No. Okay. Are you seeing the screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. This is a great conversation. Really always so happy to and and interested in speaking with students. So hope that what you come away from today is inspirational and also helpful in your journeys for your careers. So I'm Cortney Worrall. I'm the president of the Waterfront Alliance, and just a little bit about us. The Waterfront Alliance, we've been around for 15 years, and our work is to inspire and affect resilient, revitalized, and accessible coastlines for all communities. We are a bi-state organization. We work in New York and New Jersey. And we also have a ratings program for waterfront development that is now nationally applicable. It has been for a while, and it's growing, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But I'll just talk a bit about what we do. We do a lot of education. We have a big conference every year. We do work with students on STEM-based education on the waterfront. We advocate for public access to waterfronts and coastlines. We take credit for the majority of the advocacy that led to the 5-borough ferry service for New York City that Mayor de Blasio established. We do a lot of advocacy for climate resilience, and we also run the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines program, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just to put into context the Waterfront Alliance, and also I think this discussion today. So this is a picture that's in the National Archives from 1974, actually, so not that long ago. But it was a year after the Clean Water Act was passed. And this, I believe, is around Stuyvesant Park Cove, just south of the UN, before the park was established. And it shows, according to the footnote, it shows a construction vehicle dumping construction debris into a barge. The barge will then take this construction debris and dump it into the New York, New Jersey Bight, which is basically the section at the mouth of the harbor that goes farther down across to Long Island and New Jersey. And this was considered progress, actually, to be able to take construction debris and waste and move it to a location farther away from the city to not pollute the city's waterways was progress. And this was only in the 1970s. So we have been fighting, and fighting is maybe not the right term, but we've been dealing with, for the last century, significant contamination from the industrial past of our region of the United States that has affected coastlines and waterways and water quality all across the country. And we have, though, made a lot of progress. So this is a recent picture of what we consider, and many people consider, one of the great victories in the United States, which was the passage and the implementation over time of the Clean Water Act that led to major improvements in water quality. And we are seeing now, for the first time, even with climate change impacts, we're seeing more wildlife, whales in greater numbers, larger numbers of fish, seals, some increases in bird populations, though birds are a different story. And all of that is due to the progress, the environmental progress that's been made, and significant progress, especially because of the Clean Water Act. So the Waterfront Alliance, one of the things that we do is we were established to help continue to guide that transition from the industrial era to the post-industrial era to what is now a modern era where we are making sure that the plans and the policies for the coastlines and waterfronts of New York and New Jersey are equitable, are sustainable, and that they are grounded in what we need for the whole set of uses across the waterfront, everything from industry to wetlands preservation. So it's a broad mission, and our goal is to make sure to guide that in the best way possible. So just a few highlights of our work. We spearhead the Rise to Resilience Coalition, which is a coalition fighting for great climate resilient legislation, policy, etc. It's a lot of work, but we have some victories. One thing that we did recently is New York State passed flood disclosure legislation for all residential leases in New York State. So from now on, if you rent a home or an apartment, the landlord is obligated to give you the history of the previous flooding and future potential flood risks at that home, so you can make good decisions. Then the other thing we do, which I'll talk about a little later when we get into the discussion, is that we run a program to verify waterfront and coastal developments to make sure that they meet standards for climate resilience, for ecology, and for community responsiveness. It's called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, or the WEDGE program. People across the country are certified now as WEDGE professionals, and it's a course that you can take on our website. And the East Side Coastal Resilience Project is now, as of just a few days ago, officially a WEDGE verified project, where the project has met enough standards to be verified as a wedge project. It now is one of 12 in the country, most of which are in New York, New Jersey at this time, and there are a number that are being verified in different places, including Florida, and potentially, or will be verified potentially in Florida, Massachusetts, and potentially Washington State as well. So I can talk a little bit more about that, but the importance of wedge is that it provides a standardization of what is the best in waterfront design, forward-looking, going beyond code, going beyond what is required by government, and to recognize the projects that do go above and beyond, so that they are given the credit they deserve, and the developers are incentivized to take those extra steps. So that's the end of my presentation. And thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Courtney. Next, I want to ask Frank from the Lower East Side East River Residents Committee to introduce himself. Thanks, Frank.
Great. Thank you. You can hear me, and can my
Yes.
screen be seen? Okay,
Yes.
fabulous. Thank you for having me, Matthew and Daniela, for the arrangements, and for all my co-panelists, and for everyone here in attendance and who's going to be watching in the future. As said, my name is Frank Avila-Goldman. I live on the waterfront of the Lower East Side. I actually live in an affordable housing development called Gouverneur Gardens. And what you see in front of you is just a picture along the edge. Our group formed together in 2019, and we run the gamut. So it's subsidized housing. So I don't know if my mouse can be seen, but right north of the Brooklyn Bridge is Smith Houses, NYCHA campuses. And then you move along, we have different membership teams, residents from Land's End 2, for example. We have 82 Rutgers, we have NYCHA campus, Baruch Houses, myself from Gouverneur Gardens, 227 Cherry. And we came together, actually, here's another picture, not everyone's captured here, but we came together because we realized that a lot of the conversations were being had, particularly around resiliency projects, but more than just that, but they were being had without the actual direct input from resident leaders and their residents themselves. And we wanted to get involved in the processes of understanding, rather than having decisions made for us, to understand what we could, I guess, amend, and also just so that elected officials and city agencies hear directly, and also because we're on the waterfront, just as an example, and I think this will come up in a little bit, my development, for example, I'm about a mile away from the nearest subway, from Essex to Lansing. So we all know that we are further from transportation hubs. We're really, we're developed from the 50s and 60s in the city, when there was the tenement blights, and then this is all landfill, by the way. We had various subsidized housing. So just as reference, we like to say the NYU Furman Center has about 29,803 units of housing for low-income working class New Yorkers. So the Lower East Side contains the largest concentration of subsidized housing in Manhattan. It's also an environmental justice area, with about 28% of the census tract residents, according to the 2014 to 18, they're living below the poverty line. And that's according to last year's Environmental Justice for All report. And here you just have highlighted, this is one of the slides used in the ESCR program, the different NYCHA campuses. So our perspective is, with respect to the ESCR, is that we are the front line. As one of our former members would say, Nancy Ortiz, we are the living wall. But here are just a few examples of some of the things we've done, because people might be aware that there's a lot of controversy around ESCR. So we teamed up last year with Goals. That's the executive director, Damaris Reyes, and the organization is Good Old Lower East Side. And we created a bilingual pamphlet because we understood that there was a lot of misinformation going around surrounding ESCR. So these are the kind of, I guess I would say, missions and achievements that we do. We do a lot of letter writing. We had earlier this year, we had a resolution where we were able to get goals, again, a political organization, United Democratic Organization, and CODA, that's Coalition for a District Alternative, to sign on to it. And this had specifically to do with ESCR, and as reaffirming different components of ESCR. And also we asked for different community requirements. And so that's a lot of just what we're doing on a monthly basis, is picking different, I guess I would say, resiliency projects, but also sometimes there are downtown revitalization initiatives. And the last I'll end with is that during COVID, so we're talking March 2020, the residents committee really came together in really meaningful ways, because our residents were hit very hard. I think there are a lot of populations across the city that can relate. And we shared a lot of resources. So we share resources continually. To my knowledge, there hasn't really been across some subsidized housing leaders from very diverse backgrounds and have very strong opinions, and sometimes fall on different sides of the aisle on important issues. But our thought process was to be able to come together so that we could be more at the table instead of having decisions made for us. So that's just a synopsis, and I'm going to pass it on, but thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Really appreciate that. Next up, we have Sarah Neilson from New York City Parks.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, and you can see my slides. Okay, I'm Sarah Neilson. I'm from New York City Parks. I'm in the Office of Planning and Environment, and my team works on resiliency projects and waterfronts and greenways. And I wanted to just kind of take a step and reflect on, there we go, sort of just the Parks Department and waterfronts in general. We know this, but there's nearly 9 million people in New York City. We have 30,000 acres of parkland. And what you may not know is that we have 520 miles of waterfront, and about 160 miles of that waterfront is actually within the jurisdiction of the Parks Department. So when we think about waterfronts and resiliency, it's really a parks issue that we are actively working to address. Like I said, 30,000 acres. This is a picture of Hunters Point South in construction a couple of years ago, but you can see this is a resilient environment. We're actively working on sort of this variety of waterfronts that we have, from more serene landscapes, but we really want to get people out at the waterfront, these opportunities to actually engage with the water. We want people to be able to see and view the waterfront, to move along the waterfront, as well as just experience that connection. We're a maritime city. We were developed here because of the deep port. And so that's really important as a way that we think through our parkland. And also that we have so many of our recreational facilities on our parks that are right at the water's edge. So when we think about climate change and resiliency planning, this is a map showing New York. The dark green are parks that are in the 2100 flood zone. And then you see how much of the city is in the shades of the blue. The 2050s is the 100-year, and 2015 is the more urgent areas, even closer in the 100-year flood zone. So when we overlay that with the parks themselves, each of these orange dots is a parks facility, and you can see how many we have that are engaged in the flood zone. And that means that, again, there's a big need for us to think through, what does it mean to be resilient? And we're really thinking it through in both ways, as far as resiliency is being able to come back and respond to a shock or a stress. So a shock is a big storm surge type of event, or a really heavy rain event. And then the stresses are that sort of daily or monthly tidal inundation that comes with sea level rise that we know is happening. And so we're really focused on understanding what that means to our parks and planning. Like I said, we're really focused on increased precipitation. There's been so many events in the last couple of years that have really highlighted that, as in addition to the ongoing concerns about sea level rise. and of course, extreme heat. This is my favorite picture for obvious reasons, but we really want to make sure that our parks facilities are creating an environment for people to be resilient. It's a really hot day, you have places to go, you have comfortable places, and that we're still bringing that sense of joy and fun into the parks experience. I wanted to highlight right after Sandy, we did, kind of start to codify what we had learned about the sites that had recovered well from Sandy and the sites that didn't. And so we kind of put together these internal parks guidelines for how we think through our site planning and our work going forward. And it's really about site by site. There isn't just sort of one answer for every location because there's such a diversity of parks properties and communities and ways that we have needs of those sites. But overall, we want parks to provide access, to recover quickly, and really think through the risks when we're doing the design. And then when there's a chance, we want, it needs to bolster those ecosystems, adapt for sea level rise. And when it makes sense and it can work, then we want to help with the general kind of community scale coastal resiliency. And I do have this link here, and I'm going to put it in the chat if anybody wants to have a look at the guidelines just for awareness. And I just end here with a slide of ESCR. I think we'll hear a lot more about this, but again, it's the section that's in construction, or the PA2 that started construction first up here in the north. And then there's flood walls. And then you see here the orange where the flood protection moves under the park. And then it comes back out down in the southern end by Frank's house and Trever. So that's my introduction. And I'll just post this link in the chat if I can figure out how to do it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That's super helpful. Next up, we have Amy Chester. Amy, can you hear us? Are you still here? Oh, you're muted. Oh, I got to ask you to unmute, I think. I'm sorry. We're having fun with the Zoom today. Stand by, everyone. It's totally on me. That should do it.
Okay, thank you. I've never been on a Zoom where you couldn't unmute yourself. For someone like me, that's like very hard. But good morning, everybody. My name is Amy Chester, and I'm the director of Rebuild by Design. I didn't bring any slides. I just wanted to talk to you about who we are and what we do. We began after Hurricane Sandy as an initiative of HUD. HUD set aside $1 billion of the disaster recovery funds to create a large-scale design competition that brought together global expertise, local governments, and local communities to think about the future. And we did that in a two-stage process. One is collaborative research and one is collaborative design. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I just tell you that because every single thing that we do since Hurricane Sandy has had those two stages. So essentially what we do is we bring together a bunch of experts, where they're experts in their own communities or experts from international experts, and we bring them together to work together and to uncover the research together. So always trying to figure out what are the ways that we're learning together. How can we learn from architects and hydrologists and scientists and community organizers about what should happen? And then we design things together. So we design either a policy or a specific place. And it takes a lot of different forms, which I'll tell you a little bit about later in the program. But I think that the most important piece of this is to know that we are process oriented. So it's not only about what you do in the end, it's how you get there. How are you doing it in ways that everybody is learning together and everybody can kind of take away and build relationships to make the projects better. One of the projects that we did, I'll just highlight, is the New York State Bond Act that came from a report that we did, which we uncovered that every single county in the past 10 years from when we put out the report had disaster declarations in New York State. Every single county had disaster declarations for flooding in New York State, and 60% of counties had more than 5. So that's a good example. We put out a report, we did some research, we brought together many different voices from labor, from environment, from business, and we put together a strategy to convince the governor to create a bond act. That bond act is now going to be on the ballot. So if you are a New York State voter, which I hope you all are because you are living in New York State right now, if you're going to NYU, you can actually vote on a $4.2 billion bond act that will support ecological and flood resilience and a lot of the projects that we are going to talk about today. So good to see you all, and I look forward to having this discussion.
Thank you, Amy. And then now I'd like to turn it over to Trever Holland from Community Board 3.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to speak here. I think this is great, and it's really good to be part of this panel and these esteemed colleagues who I think I've been on a number of panels, but I know that this one has a good mix of people and a good, people with expertise who are able to speak. So the students probably don't realize it, but this is a really good panel. I will say I've been a part of the community board for the last 7 or 8 years. And before that, I was involved with the community and waterfront planning, especially resiliency, for 10 years, and for almost 2 decades with planning on the waterfront. I live on the waterfront, as Frank has mentioned. My building was flooded during Sandy. In fact, our whole building was devastated during Sandy. So this has a personal touch for me, other than just being the chair of Parks and Waterfront for Community Board 3. I'm also part of a resident-led group called Tough LES, or Tenants United for the Lower East, fighting for the Lower East Side. We're more focused on the area between Montgomery Street and the Brooklyn Bridge, or to relate it to flood resiliency, there's a sister project called BMCR, or Brooklyn Montgomery Coastal Resiliency, which is also where we're about to start construction on that project to protect a series of low-income and NYCHA housing. I joined the community board many years ago because I felt there was a lack of representation from my particular community along the waterfront. And I've learned a lot since joining the community board. I would encourage all you students to attend a community board meeting. Just make sure you've carved out some hours and bring your popcorn, because they're usually quite dramatic. But I wanted for my voice to be heard. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to make sure that my opinion had some weight. And I felt the community board was a proper place to do that. I don't think it's the only way. I think it's just a part of the process of getting involved in your community. I will say that a lot of the work, or a lot of the volunteer work, because it's volunteer, I do not get paid, happened after Sandy. I think I got way more involved in trying to push to get some money for this particular area. I know that I met Amy at least a decade ago, or maybe 9, 10 years ago. And we've seen the same path of really talking about design and how things can happen, to a point where we're now doing groundbreakings and finishing up on these resiliency projects. So it's not only a personal thing, but also, a volunteer effort as the chair of Parks and Waterfront for Community Board 3. But thank you.
Thank you, Trever. And I just want to echo what Trever said. We are so pleased to have such a great representation from different sectors of the community and planning here. Just as a reminder, this is a part of a multi-year effort from the Urban Lab to try to convene stakeholders, experts, community participants, and try to raise all their voices up in the overall planning process for the FDR as a whole. And we are focusing in today on ESCR. And so with that, I would love to ask Amy to give us a little bit of background on how ESCR was born. I know you have quite a lot of information and background and context for us. So if you don't mind educating us, we'd appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. And I promise if you give me control of my mute, I will not take advantage of it.
I wish I knew how. I'd do it. I promise.
I promise. We're all in these panels and we're used to it by now. So ESCR actually started as a vision called the Big U. So after Hurricane Sandy, as I mentioned before, the government set aside $1 billion to create a rebuild by design competition that would link, as I mentioned, experts in the world to community members. So what was interesting about this competition is that it was the first time that disaster recovery funds in the US were being allocated to something in the future, not just building back what you had before, but looking ahead. And this was very innovative at the time. This was under President Obama's Hurricane Sandy task force. There's one team that was labeled the big team, which is the Bjorka Ingalls Group and One Architecture and many other members of the team that brought expertise. And they worked with the communities on the Lower East Side to think about what a multi-use flood protection could look like for the area of Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, which is the floodplain. And that goes from about East 40 on the east side to West 57th on the west side. So it's a really, really big area. And as you know, in Manhattan, there's not much space. So there's only so much you can do in each of those places. But they wanted to make sure that whatever they were designing is going to be in response to the community's needs. So they did a number of different outreach sessions. I should say that the city actually asked them to start in the Lower East Side, which is the lowest income area in Manhattan and the most diverse, because it had a majority of government owned or government sponsored buildings that weren't going to have a private sector, kind of market approach to becoming resilient. So they started off with really kind of digging down and designing the first component of that, which follows East River Park mostly. And they worked with community organizations, all different types of stakeholders, had many, many different meetings, and learned that the community wanted better access to their park. They wanted their park to be more for community members instead of a kind of regional destination as it had become. They care very much about health issues. And they also care about sight lines to the waterfront and things that, all of us care about a lot. So East River Park, I don't know if anybody's going to go into details on this. Some kind of flashed the images, but I want to be clear that East River Park is right next to the waterfront, kind of at the same level, which abuts a major highway and then has the residents that live behind it. Because these are all flat surfaces, the water came in from Hurricane Sandy from the waterfront and traveled all the way to Avenue B. So there was a lot of destruction in the park. The park lost a lot of trees. There's also a lot of destruction to the homes and the neighbors and the businesses that are from essentially the waterfront to Avenue B. So the idea was to create some type of barrier within the park to stop that waterfront, stop the storm surge from hitting it. So they outlined a vision that started with this project and went all the way down and kind of looped around Manhattan with the most, I'd say the most detailed part was this area. And they created this vision in different segments. And the first segment has been renamed Eastside Coastal Resilience Project. So this is part of the entire Big U vision. And when the government took it over to implement it, they renamed each of the sections. So if you hear anybody talk about ESCR or BMCR or LMCR, they're all different sections in this overall vision. So this vision came out of a very tight collaboration with the residents and the city agencies. And just so we can put it all out on the table so everybody knows what happened, is that this project was being implemented by the mayor's office as a lead with many city agencies, the Parks Department, of course, too. And over a 4.5-year period, the vision was pretty much finished. So they took it from the very initial vision and then the government transitioned to make it their responsibility to implement the vision. And they did 4.5 years of outreach meetings. They created a community task force that they met with every month. And just about the end of that vision, the mayor's administration, the last administration, decided to change the vision without talking to the community. And that caused a humongous rippling effect of many things that happened that made the community very angry and in some cases very, very, very divided. So a lot of what you hear about this project today is very different than the project was even 2 years ago, because the community has a very vocal small group of people who are not in favor of the new project. The difference in projects is that the original vision was using the backside of the park to become the berm. So essentially leaving the rest of the park flat and which would end up being flooded over time. And I'll say that East River Park is not built as a park that could be flooded. So in order to be really true green infrastructure that could be flooded, the trees and the plants need to be able to withstand the salt attenuation. So the original was that it would use the backside of the park to stop the water. And the new vision uses the entire park. So raising the entire park 8 to 10 feet, and now that entire park will stop the water. There is upland and sewer investments that will make sure that the rain can get out. So it is definitely a comprehensive plan. In that plan, one of the team's vision was to deck over the FDR Drive. And they created images that I can show you to show what that would look like. This was the long-term vision at the time. The mayor's office actually asked that those images were taken out of the final proposal because they didn't want to overpromise what they couldn't deliver, or they didn't want to maybe have that conversation at the time. This is now 9 years ago, and we have come quite far. And there is an open conversation in our country about taking down these roads that divide neighborhoods. So we're definitely in a new place and excited to have this conversation. I will just quickly show you, and I know you can see it all, but what it essentially looks like is, this is what it looks like today. This is what it looks like if they use the back portion of East River Park for the berm. So this was their original plan, and then thought about it as an entire new park that could be adjacent to the existing park that would cover the FDR Drive, and that would bring residents closer to the park. So these were the original visions that at the time the mayor's office wasn't ready to share. So I'll stop there because I look forward to the conversation.
That was great. Thank you for that history, Amy. So I want to now turn to Sarah and just ask Sarah to give us a little bit of the progress of Eastside Coastal Resiliency today. Also understanding that while Sarah works for Parks in the city, this is actually a DDC-led project, but she's been kind enough to give us some updates and highlights.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone. And I don't know if I said it earlier, but thanks for having me. I was so excited to start talking about parks. I might have skipped that part. So thanks so much. Yeah, so as Amy said, we are underway, we're moving forward. I wanted to mention, as we were sort of finalizing and doing the approvals to move forward with the project, you're all familiar with ULURP, and in order to achieve that ULURP certification, we did work really closely with Trever and with Frank and members of the community on our mitigations for the project, because in order to build, we need to close segments of the project, and we knew that was a huge impact. So we are doing many city agencies are coming together to do sort of additional work in the neighborhood to sort of mitigate the impacts of those closures. And one of them is something that you'll be hearing more about, in a year or so, but we are doing a study with DOT about greening the FDR, and they are starting to think about how some of these proposals, like the ones Amy was just looking at, could actually, what sort of feasibility there might be for a few of those. So that'll be an interesting thing to sort of dovetail with the conversation that the Urban Lab is carrying on. So that was my sidetrack preamble. But so as I said, the construction is underway. The northern segment of the park, which is of course called PA2, and it started first, but it's PA2. That one is about halfway through construction. I think it was meant, Matthew, you mentioned at the beginning that we've actually reopened Astor Levy Park, and you can see the flood wall that's there. So I encourage you all to skip class one day, or maybe take a class field trip and go up, and you can look around at Astor Levy. You can see the flood wall. You can also cross over the FDR. There's a gas station there, and you can look southbound from there, and you can see the gigantic flood wall that's actually in place, which is exciting to see the type of progress. So that one is about halfway through. Down south in Project Area 1, which is the East River Park, is much larger and in some ways quite a bit more complicated as far as the constructability and various things going on. So that one's at about 20-25%, and we'll be making progress apace. But we are underway and moving. And there is if you want to really kind of go into the weeds, there is a project email that you can join and get like the construction updates on a biweekly basis and really see what's out there. And then you can kind of go if you even wanted to like, look over the overlooks and have a look at what's happening if you're an infrastructure nerd, which I'm assuming many of you are. So, and I can find the link to how you can join that and put that in the chat as well.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned you're looking at some efforts around greening the FDR. I'm curious, what other key factors would we say are part of the ESCR project regarding sustainability? Obviously, you've outlined them and Amy has outlined a couple, but can we just kind of reiterate them at the top level for those that are here?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a big city family that's working on this project, and DDC is sort of the lead infrastructure construction agency. So they build water mains and roads and things, and then we all work together. So they're lead, but like I said, we're all a team. And so I talked with them about this, and there's a program, it's called Envision, and it's kind of like LEAD or kind of like Cortney and the Wedge guidelines, where it's a program that sort of outlines a sustainable guideline for construction and infrastructure projects. So they've actually folded in quite a bit of those requirements and specifications into the construction contract for ESCR. And as I was reading them, I was sort of like, oh, it's in a way it's reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Like it's about, less amount of packaging, about materials that's coming in. It's quite a bit about recycling the construction and demolition waste. There was that amazing image that Cortney showed about the demolition waste getting dumped into a barge. And that's actually like, we just want to have less of all of that, like from the get-go. In addition, they want to do as much salvage as possible. And then another aspect is that they're doing quite a bit of the work bringing material to the site via barges. And that can reduce some of the amount of the truck traffic, but I'm sure Frank and Trevor can attest there's still truck traffic going through. We haven't been able to end that entirely, but it is an effort in the right direction of more maritime delivery of materials. And I wanted to highlight that within the Parks Department, we are doing a program to salvage some of the wood that we had to chop down a lot of trees, and we're able to salvage some of that wood into reusable wood materials. And so there's actually a project that's going on the other side of the river with a local company that repurposes wood into lumber materials and then makes it available. So we're doing some of that as well.
Excellent. Amy, was there anything you wanted to add? Should I unmute you?
No, I think we should get into the conversation. Sarah and I might have lots to add.
Great. Okay, thanks. Frank, I want to turn to you. At the Urban Lab, we talk about environmental justice as composed of issues of social equity with regard to access to the waterfront, dealing with increased asthma rates in low and moderate income communities, the priority of damage protection for different neighborhoods, including recovery and resilience work. With ESCR, how have you seen projects be prioritized in what areas? And how do you think EJ was taken into account in the design and implementation of ESCR?
Thanks. I want to just first answer, or the question wasn't asked, but when Amy was showing the ESCR project area, which is segmented into project area 1 and 2, one of the things that really struck me, and because I live on the waterfront and I face Brooklyn, who for me, they have the best view, which is us in the sunset. But when you look across Dumbo, when you look to Long Island City and everything in between, you're looking at a lot of different kinds of public-private ventureships for parks. East River Parks, it's a parks system, plural, is 2.4 miles of public park. That really matters for me and for a lot of the people that I work with, because you're talking about a resiliency project, as Amy said, which was, I think, about maybe 338 million of HUD money granted for NYCHA campuses in particular. But you're looking at an enormous, complicated project, but for the public use. And, you know, there's a lot of misinformation, I would say, about, you know, real estate going to be developed in the park, or, I mean, I've recently heard that down by the amphitheater, they're girding it with certain steel structures so that there's going to be a luxury tower. And this is a problem because we are a vulnerable population. I think Trever has, and I'm just going to point it out, not to embarrass him, but I think he's done an enormous job on CB3 Parks, chairing very difficult meetings over the last few years, a lot of which, I mean, sometimes I couldn't stomach, to be frank. The qualifier to what Amy said about this project being divisive, I will just say that I don't think that this neighborhood has been divided by the project. I think this neighborhood was already divided before the project started. And I think these divisions really ripened from this project based on who decided what is the best preferred alternative for this community, which also comes from the use of East River Park. And so, the people that I try to work with in the residence committee are the subsidized housing leaders. They are elected. They're not always going to be the TA presidents themselves if it's a NYCHA development. But we really try to get as broad a band of collaborators, and even if they're not members, they attend our meetings from time to time. And we try to look at it as in addition to what Trever is doing in CB3 Parks, which is to be able to project facts to people and to get them as involved as possible. But it is very tough, and especially as I referenced earlier during COVID, because so much of our resources now is consumed with day-to-day living and all the challenges that are met with food insecurity, et cetera. So to go more to what you were asking about EJ, I've been looking at for a while the community health profiles that the city puts out. Again, that's based on census tract measures. And so, for example, in the latest one for the Lower East Side, or I should say Community District 3, the child asthma emergency department visit rate is the highest in the city. It's 297 out of 10,000 children. And I picked that because that's really important to me when you're thinking about how children are growing up in this community. So these issues are tantamount. They're right at the front and center of what a lot of the leadership in subsidized housing are concerned about. But as I try to point out to some of the naysayers, when this park project begun, we already had an issue with asthma rates in this community. So that tells me that there's something already pre-existing. Thank you for putting that up. That tells me that there's something already pre-existing. And so it just means that there's a greater complexity about how we have to kind of manage information. I think for the most part, and in particular, I would say there are a lot of ambitious people that are working in city agencies who I feel get it. I feel that they understand that environmental justice is really the way that we should be approaching a lot of these large scale projects. But I do think that there are probably bureaucratic components to something like this, for example. And I think, the city did right when they switched the plan by going to the NYCHA and affordable housing leaders directly to their residents to try to showcase the change in plan and the values. Some of them are, we in subsidized housing don't ever want to relive a Con Ed failure. We are a large senior population all along the waterfront in subsidized housing. And there are NORC communities around here that's naturally occurring retirement communities, which are by their very nature unplanned. And my building, for example, is 21 stories. And we have seniors and people on medical equipment. And during Sandy, I think it took me probably, I want to say it was about 5 to 6 days before I saw a FEMA truck. and it wasn't near Water Street, which is where I live. You know, it was several blocks away. So we started examining, and all of that, I'm just trying to compile it into, I do think the city did the right thing. We're very grateful that the city picked us for the launch of this plan. Of course, you never really want to go first because of you know, the learning along the way. I have a bit of a bone to pick with the fact that Project Area 2, which is a higher income area, residential area, and I know that I understand that there are a lot more intricacies involved in uplifting an entire park, 8 to 10 feet, but they are much more underway. And I know a lot of leaders that I speak with, that's an issue, that's a problem, that they are getting their flood protection first, in particular when you reference that the largesse of the monies originally were really earmarked for what I showed you earlier on the map, where these NYCHA campus communities that, again, it can't be said enough, that are on the front lines. We don't have the same responsiveness than maybe someone in private housing would to recoup. We have to deal, you know, I know that there was a Cranes report out last year where some people from Jacob Riis were highlighting the fact that they are dealing with other volumes of moisture that come from just rainstorms. And Ida taught everyone that you don't even have to be along the water. But I'll just end with, because they're dealing with a lot of mold issues, and those issues are compounded by storm surge as well. So environmental justice, I think, really needs to be at the forefront, but I think they need to also understand that city agencies need to figure out how to reach communities a little bit better as well. Because in that vacuum, a lot of misinformation, and like I said, people are aware of the asthma rates prior to ESCR's implementation. So there's a sensitivity around that. And it relied upon a lot of average citizens like myself. This was not my forte, but I made it my business, as did a lot of other leaders, to attend as many meetings and review as many plans as possible, and spend, as Trever said earlier, our volunteer time to be as much on the understanding level as we can to be able to pass it on to our residents. So in any case, I'll let you follow up with the next question, but I could go on and on about an EJ community and awareness. Thanks.
I appreciate that. So Trever, you were name checked maybe 5 or 6 times in that particular segment. So I'm going to switch up the order and come to you next and just ask you to maybe talk a little bit about the role that the community board has played, and how that has been in design and implementation, and maybe touch a little bit on some of the EJ issues if you'd like.
Sure, I think Frank covered a lot of the EJ issues. I will mention just one thing that's connected to that. I don't know if as a city or as a nation, we've really yet defined what that means and what we should be doing. I'll give you an example of the congestion pricing for the FDR. You know, I'm on a panel that was discussing the impacts on environmental justice communities. One of the things they mentioned is that traffic would actually increase up the FDR from the Brooklyn Bridge all the way up, because it would be essentially a free area. And if you look at that, you say, okay, how did the Lower East Side and the FDR in this congestion pricing plan actually get more traffic, which would increase asthma rates and other health issues, when this is an environmental justice area? I'm not sure where that's going. I know congestion pricing has been stalled, but they still want to do it. But you would think that if you're talking about reducing cars, getting cars off the street, that would be more beneficial to environmental justice communities. But that's just like one example of, we've really yet to define what that means and what we're going to do about it. I think the country is moving in that direction. I think the funding that's been allocated to remove some of these barriers, these historic barriers in certain communities, you know, is starting to be doled out. I'm not sure exactly if New York is going to get any of this money, but I think it's a good start. As far as the role of the community, well, that's a whole another monster. I will say that, as Frank has mentioned, the meetings have been quite very difficult to manage, with different opinions and different people coming to meetings. But I think what the board is trying to do is to try and get some consensus from the community about issues or about projects like this. It's not the only place. The city agencies, and I know there's some on here right now, have gone to various different developments and homes and community rooms. But you need to form some consensus, and you need a neutral ground for people to meet. What people don't also realize is the community board is only advisory. We cannot, tell an agency to do something or vote to allow for something. We give an advisory opinion. It does have some weight and influence, but it's not the final vote. Ultimately, the agencies or developers decide what they're going to do. In terms of, getting involved in people, I mean, I started maybe 15 years ago, and I remember going to meetings initially and trying to get people to go, saying, hey, they're talking about building, some flood protection, and you get a few people to go. But when projects take 10, 15 years, you're going to lose a lot of people. But what the community board can do is becomes at one place where all this information stays and people can go, because I don't see a lot of the same faces from 10 or 15 years ago that I see today, just because people, they have lives. It's very difficult to stay involved for so many years for one project that you're not even sure was going to happen. I will say also, when talking about decking over the FDR, as Amy has mentioned, we did discuss that. And I know that residents had some concerns, one of them being relocated out of the first four floors of the NYCHA apartments. They would have to be relocated. It seems like it might be simple, makes sense, but it's very difficult to get people to move. But also that it might have been a bit challenging considering how much it would cost and whether you can get something done. Those factors were weighed in making that decision. The community board is not perfect, never will be, and no community meeting is perfect. Everyone wants to talk more than their 2 minutes, which is understandable. But when you have 100 people who all want to speak and a limited amount of time, you have to find a way to be able to listen to everyone, in a respectful way, but also to be able to manage time and manage people's times, not just the community board, but, folks go to these meetings to get some information. I know from my personal experience, a lot of the projects I've been involved with wind up on the shelves as a glossy book from some planning. And I know that I didn't want to see this personally for flood protection projects. So I'm pretty happy that the Lower East Side has two major projects, nearly $2 billion, if not over, to protect the city's stock of the highest concentration of NYCHA apartments and affordable homes. I think that's unprecedented. I will say that when this was first announced, as things began to move on, the city got some criticism by saying, okay, why are you pouring all this money in the financial district area? You should be spreading it out. I don't think people realize that this is exactly what environmental justice actions were designed to do, to protect this stock, but it still got criticism because people think of Manhattan as only a place where the elite folks live. I think I'll end on that. I know it might get some follow-up questions, but I think that's a good synopsis of where the community board is. And I'll add one thing. It's not my vote. It's comprised of 50 members. So there are 50 people who have to vote on a particular thing. And for the ESCR, it was a unanimous vote of every single community board member. And they all live in various areas in Community Board 3.
Thank you, Trevor. There's so much there I want to follow up on, but we'll keep marching through some of our topics, quite diverse, which is why there are multiple forums here. I think the issue of governance and spanning across 10 and 20-year projects is really a good one. I know the students have been examining the 30-year fights over things like Hudson Yards as well with the community board. So we'll return to that at some point. But in this talk, we've hit so far on major issues of infrastructure, resiliency, parks. We've started talking about some of the issues of public and affordable housing and environmental justice. Cortney, I want to turn to you to, if it's possible, broaden this even a little bit more and think a little bit about waterfront planning in general, how we think about both the FDR in general, ESCR, and how climate resilience and waterfront revitalization can work together in planning.
So I think I'll respond a little bit to what I've heard also so far, but I think that I'll I'll just talk broadly by saying and I know you all know this, that, you know, we're facing major change in the city and in all parts of the country, especially those that have any type of shoreline. Water is one of the biggest changes that climate change will be a part of. And so how are we going to move forward with the best in design, the best in planning? And, you know, I know that there are a lot of answers here, Amy, you know, and Sarah, and in terms of Parks Department, and then our own programs and Envision are striving to answer those questions. But I think that what's really interesting about this conversation is that, and a lot of things that Frank and Trever said, is that there's a big issue with funding, and how are we going to afford all of what we need to do, and how do we prioritize where that funding is spent? And I think it's really important to reemphasize what Trever said about the funding going to a part of Manhattan that will protect a very large community of public housing, and that those types of decisions for equity are part and parcel of every planning strategy. So we need good designs, we need good processes, but in the end, we also need the money. And so I think what we need to think about, and I think as practitioners, as you all move forward in your careers, is that who's going to pay, how we're going to pay, and how that money gets from, which is usually the largest source of funding, which is the federal government, to the state, to the city, and how does the city build enough revenue in order to pay for what's needed in the future. So I would also say that what happens in Washington, D.C. is critical to what happens in New York City. We have right now let's hope it's not a once in a lifetime opportunity for federal funding. We'll see what happens with the midterm elections and also with the next presidential elections in terms of the country's appetite for preparing and funding climate resilience. But we are right at this moment. I believe I can clearly say that some of the departments in New York City that are responsible for making sure that money gets to the right projects and decisions are being made are down 50% in staff right now because of the huge turnover that there's been across the country and people changing their jobs, but also some of the policies that Mayor Adams has put into place that make it harder for people make it harder for the city to compete for the best talent and those people that would bring that funding and those longer term strategies to bear because of the money that we have to spend on them. So then the other point I want to make is that, you know, Trever and Frank are volunteers, and they both mentioned this, but it's just very, very important to recognize the role and appreciate the role that people play with their own time, taking their own time out of their own lives to make sure things work right in their communities. And if the planning community and the advocacy community and the academic community does not realize and recognize and appreciate what it takes for individual residents to be a part of processes in constructive ways and also to be buffers against misinformation the way that Frank has been, then we're really missing the full picture of what's going on. And I just can't emphasize that enough, because I think a lot of us are like, I'm lucky, very blessed to have my career. I work in this field. I'm paid for this work, but a lot of us depend on the activity and the expertise and the wherewithal and motivation and passion of people who do spend hours and hours and hours of their life trying to make things work the right way. So I just want to also thank Trever and Frank for all of their work. And misinformation is out there. So clearly, you know, any role that the Waterfront Alliance and others can play in helping to get the information to the right places where it needs to go is really critical. And I'll just say one last thing about covering the FDR. I think that it's about the money, and you know, thankfully President Biden and Buttigieg have recognized that covering highways and burying them is the future. How that money gets spent, where the money is going to come from, how committed the United States is to solving these problems which are occurring, these types of really horrible transportation decisions that were made in the 40s and the 50s are affecting most urban areas. And you know, drive on I-95 from Florida to Maine, and you can see a lot of really horrible decisions that were made, and with the huge decisions we have to make as a country. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll wait for the discussion.
I think we're going to get into that discussion now. I want to have Frank kick it off a little bit with your comments, Courtney. And let me just frame it in this way. When we at the Urban Lab talk about a Green New Deal for the FDR, what we're specifically talking about, we sort of pirated and appropriated the term to talk about when so much money is spent on large infrastructure projects in their different components, how does that money actually filter down to helping the residents and the businesses of those areas, creating more jobs, creating more opportunities for citizens actually to be compensated to do this kind of work? And I'm curious, Frank, I'll just give you a bunch of different places to go with this, but when we look at the residents committee, when we think about the participation that has happened in planning and implementation and the obstacles that you mentioned before, what are some potential improvements to the process or to the support for residents to make sure that we continue to have this kind of participation, and also that there's a light at the end of the tunnel that doesn't rely on 15 years of thousands of hours uncompensated? How do we get into a new world that is more inclusive?
Sure. And I'm thanking Courtney and others, but when someone tries to sort of maybe reflect on my volunteer hours, I'm going to just respond. I'm very selfish. I live on the waterfront and I want to see my family thrive for generations. So that's really what this is about. When I first entered the resilience sphere, it was as a board member of my development, and I showed a lot of interest in what was going on. And so they earmarked me to, okay, great. And Amy Chester was putting together like a group of folks. The design, at that time, was meant to be more of a conservancy route. But I wanted to take that information and bring it back to the board, and then everything grew from there. But why I'm mentioning that is because I started to realize that conversations were well underway from city agencies, and there's no nefariousness to this, but they were well underway from city agencies, elected officials about my future and the future of my friends and family. And so, for example, there is people probably are aware of the Waterfront comprehensive plan that comes out every 10 years. A big issue for a lot of folks that I deal with is this concept of housing mobility or manage or treat. That's the original moniker they called it. And we felt that it was really kind of an affront and somewhat ironic because another big challenge that we're having over here, particularly in the Two Bridges area, is the influx of luxury towers. And as one of my residents, one of our members, Valentina, would say a lot, the money, power, influence that are coming. We're kind of one of the few bastions left in Manhattan for all this kind of luxury tower development. And we have a plan going on where the city is actively trying to prepare for communities that will have to be wholesale uprooted. But the irony is that the luxury towers are going to have their own ingrained resiliency infrastructure as part of their tower. So those kinds of concepts they're both an affront to us. And also why a lot of us have been really active in discussing ESCR. And I think a lot of people will tell you that it's not a perfect plan. But I also think that with a lot of the resident leaders, and again, I mentioned before that they're elected, they understand what politics sometimes means. They understand concepts like trade-offs. And I think that is also too often missing in communities when you have these, very seemingly imposing and frightening plans because you're not dealing with the ideal. And I think also, if I can just briefly just inject race and class into this, because it's ever looming for a lot of us, I do think there are certain sectors of the population that aren't really comfortable with them voicing something and then not getting their way or not being heard. And that, like, if they want something, it's my God, how I can't believe I talked to my elected official and they're not going to listen to me of what I want and how I want this to be shaped. And whereas I think in this project, ESCR, I have to believe that EJ was a component, but you know, they did no service to destroying all those years of collaboration, right? And that's really where the challenge has been for those of us in the residence committee, is to, you know, a lot of people, I'm going to just be very punny, I'll be very frank, you know, they're used to, you know, they're used to being, having the rug pulled out from under them. There's like that history, that habitual like feeling of like, you know, yeah, we never get listened to. Yeah, you know, we know that people have asthma and health conditions at a rate greater than other people in other areas of the city, particularly because over here, we're also next to some more wealthier AMI areas. And those are some of the voices that are, some of them are also against ESCR. So there's that tension. And then the other thing that has to be mentioned is language. Language barrier is a big thing over here on the waterfront of the Lower East Side. We, you know, we're a hybrid of like the edge of Chinatown, and then you have two bridges, and then you have going up all along, again, along the waterfront where there's a lot of Latino populations, and there's different mixes in between. I mean, I'm not going to compare it to like along the 7 train. But when you're trying to get people involved in signing on to a plan, and you're going to have meetings that can go on for 3 to 4 hours, these are challenges. And I'm not holding anyone specifically accountable, but I'm just laying that out. Like, that's a big challenge as a backdrop. But I want to give other people a chance to comment. So. Oh, wait, no, I said that and I take it back. There was one thing I wanted to, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out. Amy had mentioned it before. I just want to show something very quickly, if I can, please.
You should be able to.
The Bjork Angles group. So when she showed this image, I don't know if you can see me boxing this out.
Yeah,
yeah, great. I'll stop that share. That is a train. So people may remember here, it was an insult to a bunch of us when de Blasio was talking about the BQX. Because that really felt like a transportation design exclusively for real estate and luxury real estate. As I said earlier, it's just shy of a mile for me to walk to Essex Delancey, a subway hub. And that's not uncommon for people along the waterfront. I would love to see, because now we know that the city is willing to fund with New York City Ferry a transportation system that isn't really meeting the mark of the people taking it, and it's being highly subsidized. We need a transportation, whether it's a trolley or something, all along the waterfront of the Lower East Side to connect these very diverse neighborhoods. So that, aside from taking over the FDR, when I saw that originally years ago, I was like, oh my God, like, please someone invest in that. Please connect these communities that are very fragile. And that are really, you know, being with the influx of luxury towers, we also know how politicians work. And, you know, maybe they're the first to give you turkeys during Thanksgiving to hand out. But when you have someone who lives in a $1.2 million 1-bedroom, all they have to do is pick up a phone and call and make things happen. And we understand that too.
Thank you. I want to open this up to all the panelists to jump in as they wish now to address some of these issues. We've left a lot of threads dangling, so please feel free.
I mean, I just want to thank Frank for reminding me about that. They created this really cool image. If we had more time, I could find it, of the existing subway map and then a U line connecting all the neighborhoods kind of at water's edge. And it is a huge issue that we heard from residents at the time of, you know, the transportation desert in that area. And what we try to do with all of our projects is build in as many benefits as possible. So making sure that every piece of infrastructure isn't just solely about flood protection, but it's also about, creating social resilience and recreation space, potentially transportation. They also had the big idea that you could locate a lot of kind of necessary infrastructure in that U area, so you can take it off the city streets.
I'll just add what Courtney had mentioned about funding and from a resident or community board perspective of whether you're going to support a project, that might take 20 to 25 years that you don't have the funding for at the time, you don't have the political will, and you may not even have the people will. I'll give you an example. Just south of this, we have the LMCR, Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Project. They recently unveiled a plan which included a budget of taking down the FDR. Now, that project, and I don't really remember the dates, I think wouldn't start until 2035, maybe. It might take another 25, 30 years to get done. That's assuming the billions of dollars are in place and we have the federal leadership to make sure that money gets there. And right now we don't have that. But I will say it was just interesting to see that in that plan of taking down the FDR in primarily a area which is much wealthier than ours, but knowing that that plan may not happen. And if it does, it might take 25, 30 years or more. It might take 10 years for that environmental impact statement, but it'll take a huge amount of time to get to complete.
Trevor, I think I'll just chime in with sort of a grab bag of thoughts I had during all these great comments that came through. I think it started with Frank and went to Courtney, but the piece about the really long time frame of infrastructure projects, both people losing attention and sort of getting worn out from the process. I hear this from the folks in neighborhoods we work with on greenways all the time. It's like, oh, I've been at this for 10 years and I had to raise my family and things like that. But I think in conjunction with that is getting the money in place and also the political timeline that we're in. I mean, I've seen this on many cases that, again, electeds are here, they're trying to serve their communities, but they also really want to see results within the time frame of their office. And sometimes it's 4 years, sometimes it's 8, but often it's 2 and 3. And that means that they want to see turnaround really quickly. And that's not sort of the time frame that we can build some of these projects. And so it's a tough thing to get them on board with the vision that's broader than they may be able to sort of reap the rewards in their period of office. Another thing sort of touching on the issue of time is, I think, some of the challenges we face in getting these implemented. There's cost, there's just bureaucracy. There's a lot of things that are built into the way that we do work for the city, which came about to prevent corruption. And so there's long waiting periods and different bidding processes and things that are very tedious and boring, but they end up adding a lot of time by virtue of the process, but then we're stuck in bureaucracy and then that adds time. We sometimes, if people don't like a project, they'll file a lawsuit and then we end up delaying a project because there's a lawsuit and then there's another one and another one. And Frank, I don't have the paperwork in front of me, but that might be part of the delays related to East River Park starting later. And then we also just have contracting issues with how long it takes just to get these gigantic firms on board to work on projects. Not to mention permitting. Our environmental regulators are fantastic and they're there for a reason. And we want the Clean Water Act and we want all these. And those are extra steps that we have to take to make sure that our projects really meet all of those goals. And then I have 2 commercials / recommendations for you guys. The first one is go to your community board, join your community board, get involved, especially, I think, Trevor and Frank, these guys are out there, they're in these meetings. They're really hard meetings. I've received a lot of the incoming in those meetings. And there's a lot, but I think fresh voices and fresh people there at these meetings is really important to kind of keep the conversations dynamic. And then there's also a really nice New York Times piece, which I'll send to you, that was by Michael Kimmelman, that's sort of about the community controversy. I think it was a really measured, balanced piece that I sent it to my mom to explain the project, to be like, this is what I've been dealing with at work and why it's hard. And so I think it's a fair assessment. So if you haven't already read it, I think it's a nice one. And there's also a podcast so you can listen on your walks. But yeah, and I just wanted to echo the thanks to all the people who are engaged in their communities, because it's so important to how like we can actually try to get our work done, is hearing so much from local activists, regular people intermittently engaged. It just makes all the difference to those of us at Parks.
Thank you, Sarah. Was that Kimmelman article, What Does It Mean to Save a Neighborhood?
I think so. It's in his program called, I'll find it and send you a link. He started a new, yeah, that must be it. Wait, is that it?
He had another one there too, The Parable of East River Park.
It's that, I think it's this one with the angel. Yeah. Headway, that's his new program. So we were the first, he's looking at big urban problems and ways that they're being addressed that are creative, but like really big picture thinking. And we were his inaugural big problem to write about.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
We are drawing to the close. We still have 5 or 6 more minutes. I want to especially invite panelists, if you have more thoughts you want to get in there outside of the structured level of questions. I do have a couple more questions, but Cortney and Amy, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to jump back in to chat about.
I'll just say the only thing I'll say, and then I'll let Amy go, but is that I think a really important area where there needs to be more scholarship and more best practices developed that are considered standard within the planning community are the multiple ways of getting feedback and community input, and also how to work with communities in terms of building political power. And so, the traditional way of getting public input is to hold a meeting, and to hold it at night, and to hold it at a time when people with children, people with disabilities, people who work night shifts, people who are taking care of an elderly person in their home absolutely cannot attend. And Zoom doesn't really solve the problem either, because oftentimes those same groups of people have a really hard time of just paying attention to anything at night. There's so much going on at night in a household. So that's just one example of how we have public input is incredibly important, but the methods of which, that you use and the methods that we use as standard practices are really outdated. And so how can we move to develop better technologies, better ways of embedding practices, like not just surveys, but phone calls, actual communication, relationships with people and communities to get their input. And so we need to do that. I think there needs to be a lot more work in that area. So speaking to folks at NYU, I hope you all take it up, and I'd love to be a part of that. I think
we'll be back in touch.
On that.
I took a note. We'll be back in touch on that. And
okay.
Also, we're gonna go to Sarah for a tour.
Yeah, we'll get you guys out there. Yeah, great. We'll find a way. Yeah.
Great. So anyway, that was my main point, and I think that that's going to be needed far into the future. And community boards are one way of doing it. Lots of cities and states have far different methods of local decision making and planning. And a lot of what we have, the infrastructure in our region and in New York City, is still, as we all know, building off of that, or trying to correct the legacy of Robert Moses and really bad decision making that took a toll on the city over many decades.
Thank you, Cortney.
Can I just add 1 second before I forget something? When you had asked about, so one of the things that we noticed, and I think this might be something that has a bureaucratic origin, but the residents committee had asked for a specific kind of training in line with maybe a union jobs or apprenticeship programs for residents directly along the waterfront. Because the way I understand it works with DDC is that, they have a, women minority-owned business requirement, but we started to see the metrics where you're getting, the jobs are in Westchester or Long Island. And it's sort of like, well, my God, I mean, we're having this done to us. So we're having ourselves cut off from a park, and then years of construction and everything that comes with it. but we're not getting the benefit of like the economic component to that during that construction either. So that's also an issue about job creation. And I think that dovetails with part of the aspirational component to the Green New Deal. But it's not designed that way, specifically to focus on zip codes, for example. Now, I know they did have recently a work with us outreach and where they're willing to help people with their resumes. I'm waiting to hear how that turned out. But that's just another example of something that we as residents are really focused on.
I just wanted to add that, like, to put in perspective that this project is, I think, the single most, if you think about all the different components of it, it's the single largest project that came out of Hurricane Sandy and one of the biggest resilience projects in the country. It's the first for our city to be implementing something like this. And it's extraordinarily complicated. And that is not to defend them in any sense, but we have all learned so much in the past 9 years. I think the number one thing that I learned is that these projects take time. We all thought that it would be built in 5 years and we'd be celebrating the entire biggie by then, and it doesn't. And in that time, we've also learned a lot. So when Hurricane Sandy hit, we didn't have a good understanding of sea level rise. And now we know that New York City will have 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise. So that has been built into a lot of our projects. There's, the green jobs aspect to it. There's a Green New Deal. We lived through a Trump administration for 8 years with these projects. So we've all been through a lot, and just want to remind people that none of this is easy.
With that, I think we're going to have to wrap. That was a good place to wrap. Amy, thank you for opening us up and wrapping us up with the wider vision. I just really want to thank all the panelists for being here. Thank you everyone for joining us. We will, at the close of this 3-panel series, which might turn into 4 panels to include FIDI, we'll write up short proceedings of what happened, and then we'll be looking at a more involved technical assistance panel probably in late spring of next year. Everything will be updated on our website, and please let people know that this is going on so we can continue to involve all the important stakeholders in this conversation. But thanks again, Cortney, Sarah, Frank, Trevor, Amy. Really appreciate you. And thanks for all of the support, Daniela and Leah. And thank you, students, for joining. Have a great day.